Well, good morning, everyone. Great to have everybody here. My name is Tom Hoffert, CEO of the Salem Chamber, and we have a wonderful panel with us this morning. Morning, Connor. Space ready here, Connor. And a great program. And it's great to have you all with us in the room. We have a great panel of distinguished leaders in front of us today, and we're going to cover a couple of topics. It is important to note that both Paloma Sparks and Brian Clem have meetings they are going to be dashing into. And so you will notice them stepping away. We appreciate their time. And so we bumped them to the front of the agenda. We will start with OBI's Paloma Sparks on an initiative that they are taking on with the regulatory modernization and economic development tools. Paloma, the floor is yours.
Thank you. With Oregon Business and Industry, if you're not familiar, we're the state's largest general business association. And I am the COO and general counsel, a little bit of everything. In 2023, we began an initiative of bringing forward proactive legislation. So we spend a lot of time in the Capitol saying no to things, and we really wanted an opportunity to control force. We've done some recent studies, and Oregon is really falling behind in terms of economic development, being a place that's friendly for business. So we've seen that, let's see, we're in terms of regulatory freedom, we are 46th. We are one of the highest states for small business closures, one of the lower states for small business openings. And in years past, this is funny, it feels like old times for me because I used to work for Senator Beyer. I used to have a lot of Senator Metsger and Representative Clem. It's the first time I've ever bumped them from an agenda. In years past, all four of us worked on regulatory modernization, and we partnered with the governor's office. And the governor's office prioritized regulatory streamlining and various improvements. We have seen that fall away in recent years. Under the Brown administration, there was no effort to make a regulatory modernization. And part of the big problem we've seen is there's a real lack of transparency in the system. So we know that agencies sometimes take many years to approve units. So I've got a member who's been waiting for a permit for 7 years. And under the DEQ and the Clean Air Act, they keep on sending everybody back to the start of the process. But there's no metric where they are publishing what they're doing in terms of permitting and how long it's taking them and what the metrics are. So one of our proposals is to require the agencies to publish regularly how long it's taking to process permits, what their backlog looks like, and what the metrics are for another proposal that we have is to require agencies to tell applicants at the front end what the application requirement is going to be, and they can't change those once you're in the process. So what we've seen a lot happening is that you're in the application process, and they will change the rules or change their policy and make you start all over again under those new rules and those new policies. If you are in the application process, we think whatever the rules were when you started should be the rules when you finish. We've seen agencies that don't abide by their own timelines. There are real consequences for a business that doesn't abide by their timeline. There are not consequences for an agency. So one of our proposals is to, if the agency blows the timeline, that applicant goes to the front of the line instead of just wherever they were in A lot of what we're looking at is also incentives on economic development. We are one of the states with the least incentives to be able to recruit businesses. And it makes it very hard for our business recruiting folks to actually be able to convince a business to locate here. We've got lots of resources. We don't have the best land use, but there are businesses that are interested in locating in Oregon, but we can't compete. So, you know, Arizona, Texas, Nevada has way better incentives that they can offer, and a business just has to make the business decision to go where it makes the most fiscal sense. So we are going to be promoting various incentives. A lot of my work has really been focused on the rulemaking and regulatory side. We've seen in recent years an attitude from agencies that is distinctly anti-business. They are not interested in helping us to succeed. They're not interested in helping us to comply with their rules. How agencies do rulemaking varies from agency to agency. There's a lack of consistency. Some of that is due to the fact that things sort of fell apart during COVID and no one was in charge. But what we'd like to see is a more centralization, more focused, so a public rulemaking manual that is actually easy to navigate for a regular person who's trying to understand what's going on. The requirement that agencies justify why they have pursued a certain rulemaking. Also, that at the federal level, state agencies or federal agencies have to do an analysis of all of the alternatives they considered, and they also have to publish all the comments they received, and then they have to justify the decision that they made of the type of rule that they tried to adopt. There are various places in state law where that is also required. If you all are familiar with the climate protection program, that is how we were successful in our challenge, because some of the rules that they adopted were under the Clean Air Act, were tied to the federal Clean Air Act, and that was a requirement that they had to justify the rules, and they had not done that. So we would like that to be an across the board requirement. The other thing is, I don't know if you spend any time in rulemaking. I sadly spend all my time there. And I'm one of those super nerdy people who spends a lot of time reading the rulemaking manual, and I know the Oregon APA better than most people. And I hate the rulemaking website. You have to know exactly what agency you're looking for. You have to be on a list for every individual agency. In Virginia, what they did is they created an a town hall website, and it has all the current rulemakings happening, all the hearings that are happening, comments that have been received, and you can sign up on that website to get notices for everything that you might be interested in. It's much easier to navigate. It's public facing instead of bureaucracy facing, which is what we have in our current system. So that's part of what we want to do. We just want them to care about their customers. And so some of this is requiring they do sort of just plain language summaries. I spend a lot of time arguing with Oregon OSHA. I'm like a professional at it at this point. And but I will say, to their credit, their rulemaking webpage is far superior. They always have a plain language memo about what they are doing and why they're doing it. It is easy to find when the rulemaking hearings are, when the comment period closes. They also almost always publish FAQs and list on their website the contact information for the person to contact if you have questions. very few other agencies do that. And frequently they just say, oh, we'll just read the rules. Some of those rules are super complicated. And are very technical and are based, are focused on very scientific measurements that you would need to pay somebody a lot of money to tell you what it means. So that is our, a big part of what we're looking at on the making side, just making it easier to navigate. Now, all of this is sort of a backdoor way to try and fix the culture problems that we see in state government. Particularly the executive branch, not the governor's office. We have a good relationship with the governor's office, but her agencies have gone rogue, let's say. So putting some checks and balances on them to require them to everyone to play by the same rules. On the governor's side, there's been a lack of interaction with business, so we are proposing a business advisory committee that will meet regularly with the governor to tell her what the real facts on the ground are. There will be lots of other things that will be part of our package. We're looking at lots of employment issues. For example, being able to give retention bonuses, making some changes to manufacturing overtime, lots of other requirements, but that's the sort of big picture of what we are working on for the 2025 session. Just want to chat about it, or you want to know any more about anything else?
Certainly rushed that. I don't know. Political side a lot that's nodding.
Yeah.
Both with our panelists, all three distinguished former legislators. But I saw a lot of heads in the audience. Bill, would you like to start us off with questions?
You spoke a little bit about the work that you created in trying to help state work practice. What we do to protect some of them, right? Some of this near here by our is the I think 5 sawmills that would close the state of work because it's just tough to do business here, right? And
Yeah.
the downstream effects of closing sawmills that we saw.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of what OBI does on that side of things is that we try and fight back as much as possible against proposed regulations. So I'm the general counsel also for OBI. I spend a lot of time filing lawsuits. I know we'll probably talk about this later, but on the CPP rulemaking, just be assured that even we're not done. We might go back to court. So we do everything that we can to protect the existing businesses, pushing back on legislation, pushing back on rulemaking to make it so they can continue to operate.
You mentioned there's some businesses that are interested in your
Because I got the information, I got that information from economic development folks, so they're not releasing their name because it's usually confidential that when they're trying to be in current negotiations, so I can't.
Yes, Mike.
So it all sounds great, but do you have somebody in the majority party who's going to help carry the water, co-sign on this, on getting some of this stuff?
We, thanks to our representative Clem, we've been successful in getting a number of moderate Democrats back into the legislature, more business-friendly Democrats. So I think there's several. Senator Kate Lieber has been very focused on the fact that we are falling behind in terms of economic development. I expect that she will be a good partner with us. Hopefully, now that she's going to be Ways and Means co-chair instead of the majority leader, maybe she'll be going to some fights. Representative Daniel Wynn is a great partner. There are a number that are very focused on this issue.
Rich.
Really a question more of a comment, just somebody that's been involved in development for many years. That whatever you can do to provide education on the value of that, what that does in moving the needle. When I talk to people that don't understand, especially previous city council people making financial decisions, you know, and stuff, they don't understand the value. That means how that changes the full economic base of obviously the state, but locally. So whatever you can do to do some real simple education on development, you know, be strong about it.
Yeah, we're, so part of what OBI does through our research and education foundation is we do a lot of studies, particularly on economics. And one of the things we're looking at is to try and show legislators the economic value of business growth. So, you know, there are lots of neat ideas that they have. Well, the only way to fund, we are an income-based state. When a business grows, they hire more people, pay those people pay income taxes. Same with business taxes. Later, I'm sure we'll be talking to you about our new IP-17, but that's a different issue. So I think the good news is that Senator Beyer really gets that. Don't have it in front of me right now, but after the revenue forecast came out, she was the only person who actually got what we've been saying, which is that the only way to continue to pay for everything that legislators want to pay for is to have strong economic growth. So we've been making that case to her for a long time and to various other legislators. We will continue to make that case, and we will have that backed up by research.
Laura, is OBI looking for partners in this space, or are you
Yes.
wanting to forge forward as an organization and have sign on later? How do you look at partnering with organizations across the state?
So we have been going all across the state. Part of the reason I have to leave early is that I'm doing a presentation to the Portland Metro Chamber this morning, and they changed my time. So we've been going all over the state. Fundamentally, one, I want you all to tell me or tell us, what are we missing? What is something that you think should be on our agenda that isn't, or a problem that we may not be aware of? Like, I spend, you know, I've been doing this for a while, but I may not know the challenges that you're facing on a regular basis. So that's a key element of what we'd like to hear. But yeah, we want a robust coalition. We're going to walk into the legislature, and this is going to be our top priority.
Well, as the VP of Oregon State Chamber and certainly the Salem Chamber, I think I'll speak for both organizations. We want to track this and certainly be a participant where we can. I don't see any negatives of this, but let me ask that perspective. What type of pushback do you anticipate?
So I think when you start talking about regulatory things and it's coming from the business perspective, the immediate reaction is, oh, you're just trying to roll everything back. And we could do that. We could bring forward a package of bills that roll back regulations. That's not what we're trying to do, because one, that feels like a fool's errand. But also, that doesn't fix the underlying problem. The underlying problem is that all of this is happening in the shadows, and agencies are not aligned, they're not consistent. And so we want to fix the systemic problems, not the individual regulatory problems. So there's a lot of interest. So my communications director doesn't like the fact that I use regulatory modernization because it doesn't roll off the tongue quite as nice. He would like me to use regulatory reform, but that's not really what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is focus really on transparency and fairness and consistency.
Any last inquiries for Paloma before he heads up to our sister city to the north?
I might stick around for a little bit, just so I can hear what these guys have to say.
Yes, sir.
Quick question, in terms of like attracting businesses, how are you working with workforce development and education to help maybe change the direction of education in terms of having a prepared workforce that comes out of schools?
So, I mean, we've long supported expansion of career and technical education in schools. We are we have started a new sort of, so we have policy sort of portfolios that we have, and workforce is a new portfolio that we've developed. We partner a lot with higher ed in terms of developing those things. We were frustrated by some of the investments that were not sustainable, and we would like to see a way to make those investments sustainable in the future. So I mean, it's a top priority. We know that we have a real problem, not just in Oregon, but nationwide, in terms of having employees that are ready to go to work and are skilled. We have, especially in the trades, we have a real lack of ready and available workforce. So it continues to be a top priority for us, and we know that it's one of the biggest challenges facing business.
Okay, well, Paloma,
Just one quick question. So we talk all the time about competing against other states for a lot of these businesses. So like the wall pulls out of China and goes to North Carolina and they built there. Do you guys look at other states and what's being offered and what that gap is? What are we trying to fill? What are you seeing out there other states are offering?
Yeah, so one of our initiatives has been to ensure that so Regional Solutions reports directly to the governor's office, and is supposed to be focused, in my opinion, on successful economic development in part. And I don't think they've been hearing from the people on the ground, especially from local communities that are doing economic development on the regular. So we propose that there should always be an economic development representative on those committees in local communities. We are working with Business Oregon to get them to refocus on their true assignment, which is economic development. I don't have a list of sort of what the actual incentives are that we're trying to get. Oregon's tax structure is tough.
Do you guys partner with the Oregon Business Resource Center or local recovery center at the Wilson Journal as far as driving like business support, teaching business owners like what they need to do and what level you need to rise to be fruitful?
We don't work at quite that sort of level. I mean, we're more focused on the big picture policy objectives. But I would be happy to work with anybody. I mean, we've been doing a lot of outreach all across the state to just talk to anybody who might have insight.
That resource center was like integral part of keeping businesses alive after COVID happened. They were only about $3.3 million in grants to businesses.
Yeah.
But they're losing funding in 2025. And so that's just gonna go away for 5 district zones for Senator Thatcher. So how can that need be elevated so that program can be funded so businesses can continue gaining the support they need to stay alive?
Well, if it's state funding, I mean, part of the issue is that we had this huge influx of federal funds and state funds. And we didn't have a plan for what to do after that.
Right.
That dried up. So, I mean, I think Senator Thatcher knows this better than I would. But, you know, gotta bring forward a funding proposal to the legislature. But I'd be happy to talk more offline. I'm easy to find if you go to OregonBusinessIndustry.com. There, and my email information is right there.
Thank you.
Want to thank you for your presentation today, and thank you, audience, for asking questions. OBI has worked very much in partnership with a number of chambers across the state, and we appreciate that partnership and communication. One thing that Paloma touched on, we are going to next month have our entire topic around the climate protection program, and so this is one sticky wicket, and we really need you all to be in attendance and see what is occurring here. This will be essentially the largest singular tax on a business or consumers that we've had in the state's history, and quite honestly, will be the largest in the nation, if not the world tax situation. So this is incredibly complex, what's coming down the tracks if things go askew. So a little bit of a teaser. Next month, our first meeting of the month is on a Thursday. That's July 4th. So that meeting will occur on Thursday, July 11th. With that, we're going to switch gears, and I am going to welcome former State Representative Brian Clem to give us an update on his Coos Bay transportation and port project. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Well, it's tough being with transportation legends like Lee and Rick. My time in the legislature, I was really in natural resource committees like ag and land use policy, that kind of thing. And I left it to others to figure out the tough work of figuring out how to get bipartisan agreements to fund transportation, given it usually involved raising taxes and figuring out projects and prioritizing projects. I never really thought I'd need to learn this much, honestly, about it. But 4 days after I left office, I got a call from these two lawyers saying, "Hey, we have this business proposal for you." And I said, "Yeah, no, I'm retired. I'm not taking any of those kind of proposals." And then they said, "Well, it's in your hometown of Coos Bay." And Coos Bay, which I'll talk about later, has had a rough time for 40 years. I was a junior when the Spotted Owl got listed. Four of my family members, myself included, all worked for Weyerhaeuser. And there were 35 mills at one point, and down to 0 for a while, at 1 now, and one kind of export facility. And so I said, okay, you know, I mean, I've tried many times to figure out something for Coos Bay and voted for different things that were sometimes controversial, like coal exports or LNG exports. I tried all of them. And so I said, what is it? And well, first I said, how many jobs? And they said several thousand. Thousand, not 100, no, thousands. I said, okay, you know, tell me more. So if we get our slides up, I'll tell you all about the journey, for at least me, to where we're at and sort of next steps. So the name of the both project and our company name is Pacific Coast Intermodal Port, PCIP. It is in partnership between the Port of Coos Bay and a company called NorthPoint Development that's the majority shareholder. My company is by far the minority shareholder, but there's 2 of us in it at the moment. There'll be more later, but we try to control our debates internally to two of us at the moment. Right, so next slide. NorthPoint is a big developer. They have several thousand employees, between 3,000 and 4,000, all around the country. Amazon is their probably biggest customer. About 40% of their business is building warehouses and data centers for Amazon, but they build a lot of industrial projects around the country, including 2 inland ports that they've built so far. This is their first ocean terminal, though. Next slide. So Coos Bay, my eyes are so bad I luckily I can't memorize it because I can't read it. But what this is saying with that orange box is Coos Bay is ideally located for a new container terminal. It's in a dead zone. We have Portland on that map, but honestly, most shippers don't consider Portland an ocean terminal. It's an inland river port, and most of them don't have Portland on their service area. But if you imagine Tacoma, Seattle, and then Oakland, and then LA, Long Beach, there's a massive gap where there's nowhere to bring your containers. So our aim is to fill that gap. It mentioned it's on there one day closer to Southern California, and I was thinking about that this morning, well, from where to who? And one of our big targets, which I'll talk later about in a minute, is Korea. And there's many shippers in Korea. But in particular, it's a great latitude for Coos Bay to be a landing point, because they are currently for what they call their southern loop for most of the big ocean carriers. They're going down to LA, and then they go back up by rail to Chicago to get they call it the hinterlands, to go into the hinterlands. So it actually doesn't make much sense for them to go that far. They do have a terminal in Tacoma, but many people go to Prince Rupert, Canada, which is an interesting situation because it's kind of like Coos Bay, small town, rural town. It only uses trains, and we're only going to use trains, no trucks. And so it's a ship to rail intermodal facility. 70% of their volume in Prince Rupert makes its way into the US. So the question is why? And it's because we haven't invested in any new ports in more than 60 or 70 years in the United States on the West Coast. And you can expand an existing port, but if you can imagine, LA, Long Beach, Oakland, Tacoma, they're all surrounded by big giant cities. There's nowhere to go in those places. You want to have a lot of what once was very used, healthy mill site industrial land go to Coos Bay, because there was a lot of industrial land available, including our site, which I think might be my next slide. Let's see if it shows it. We go to rail first. So our partner in this deal, the port, actually owns the rail line from Coos Bay up to Eugene. And it's kind of a unique situation. Often government doesn't own a rail line, but private company that did own it was getting ready to actually abandon it. It would have stranded Coos Bay forever potentially. And our federal delegation back in kind of the mid to late 90s pushed very hard to get the NTSB to transfer it or force them to transfer it to Coos Bay. The state kicked in a bunch of money. Rick was probably pretty involved in that to help get some tunnels reopened and get some upgrades made so it can operate. So it does operate now, but it's slow. And we're talking significantly faster trains and more volume. So it needs $1 billion worth of upgrades to meet our objective for throughput. It plugs in at Eugene, and then you can connect to either of the Class 1 railroads, BNSF or UP nearby. Next slide. So this is the rail part. I said $1 billion. So it's rail upgrades. It's terminal related rail that's on our property, and then it's some upgrades up in Eugene at the UP. So that's one piece of it. Then the next piece, we'll get to that in a second, but you can at least see the terminal. I'll tell you the dollar figures later. This is an old fish hatchery, and I grew up doing a lot of crabbing and stuff with my dad just to the east of it along those beaches. But there's Southport Lumber, which is the one kind of operational actual real lumber producer in Coos Bay proper there. That's our neighbor, and the rail goes to them right now and then ends. And so we're going to build a lot of tracking into our facility next to it. That shows 2 berths in the lower left corner. We're talking about a 3rd berth, but those first 2 are kind of phase 1. It's a lot of money and a lot of permitting, a lot of time. And we're starting slow at around 1.2 million containers. Which just for scale, Portland lately has been doing maybe 100,000 to 200,000 containers. So it's 8 to 10 times the container volume of Portland, but it's like 1/4 of the container volume, or even 1/6 of LA Long Beach, for example. So sort of a niche business. It runs 24/7, 365. It'll be about, so that shows you 6,500 per day. I think the next one might have the weekly number on it. I'm trying to remember the math, but this time 7. It's go ahead and go to the next slide. I think I have it on there. 4 vessels per week, 23,000 TEUs weekly. And TEUs, I had to learn all this stuff, 10-foot equivalents. So the containers are, 20-foot equivalents. The containers are actually bigger than that, but that's how it's gauged. And so at 2 berths, we can get to, I think, does that have if you go a little further, no, it doesn't. So that adds up to about 1.2 million TEUs. And that's sort of what we talked about phase 1. The key things for us to build this facility is, Lee mentioned, you know, we hope it doesn't become another failed project where you build it and then nobody uses it. Well, our $1 billion of private money is not going to be spent until the other pieces are in place, which we'll talk about in a second. We are definitely not building it hoping we will have relationships with customers. Likely they'll become investors and join us as investors before we ever, I mean, we've spent $5 million already, but before we spend much more, we will have the connections that need to be in place from other parties. So to that end, dredging is a big piece of it. You can see, I think it's 550 million. The legislature passed a special law to make clear how we will get our approvals under our Oregon land use system. My partners, when they were bringing their project permitting people in, were kind of describing, you know, I said, have you ever done anything in Oregon before? And it's no. And you're permitting experts, right? I said, have you heard of the land use goals? No. I said, well, you're gonna need to learn about them. Oh, yeah, I mean, it's just an approval, right? And I said, it's not, yeah, I mean, yes, but you heard of LUBA? No. I said, okay. And fortunately, I chaired the land use committee, so I, for everyone else's sake, probably good, but I had to learn all the painful minutia of the system. So when our attorney said, you better look at these court cases that were finalized in the last year or two, came out of the LNG facility being sued, and Coos County and the city of North Bend, and the city of Coos Bay being sued. And it was pretty much impossible to dredge any new material in anywhere on the coast because of this what's called Goal 16. So we realized, I mean, this would be a complete dead end, no matter how much money we had, no matter how many sign-on letters we had, or presidents supporting it, or congressmen and women supporting it. You still had to get through LUBA, and we were not willing to really try unless we could get the law clarified that the court had put us, all of us, in a complete dead end catch-22, where you could maintain a channel, but you could not expand it, even for safety. You could not expand it without a goal exception under these court cases. And interestingly, even the environmental groups like privately admitted to me, oh no, yeah, it's totally broken. The system is completely broken. And we know that, and we broke it. And, you know, frankly, they said, we don't want to fix it until we know what the next project is. So if it's more LNG or more coal, we're not going to help fix it. If it's something that's green, you know, maybe. And so I said, well, let me talk to my former colleagues, because I was out. I couldn't lobby legally as a lobbyist, but as an owner of the business, I could go in and talk because I'm not compensated. This is my investment. And so I was allowed to go in and participate in the legislation in ways I wouldn't have been able to actually if I weren't one of the owners. So we got it passed, and just to kind of the business climate of the legislature, to me, it was a hopeful sign. Now, you have to learn to negotiate too, that's part of it, and you have to leave some stuff on the table for the environmental groups and the tribes and others who have their, you know, they want their piece of the action too if you're gonna pass a bill. So in the end, I think it passed 57-3 and 27-3 in the Senate. It's not particularly happy with Senator Patterson for voting no, but they'll get over that at some point. She's my senator. You know, the key was really the jobs. I mean, there's a supply chain issue. All of us know it. Those of us who are involved in exporting, which we were from our fruit orchard, you know what it's like to have have labor problems in Portland and have to go somewhere else. Like there's supply chain problems. But for most legislators, the job number is what really is driving their interest. Some of them, particularly the Democrats, they want to know how many union jobs. Well, we signed project labor agreements with almost all the unions to build it with union labor and to operate a lot of it with union labor. So that's part of what you have to do in Oregon. If you want a bunch of money from the federal or state government, you end up needing to negotiate with those parties. So we have, you know, private warehouses that won't be, but for our public part of our projects, we signed some labor agreements, so that helped get some more allies. It'll raise costs some, but it helped get some allies. And that dredging law was and is the toughest barrier, we think, to the regulatory certainty that we're looking for before investing $1 billion in our own money. Next slide. So on the environmental side, like, because again, there's people like some of the environmental groups who said, we want to know what the project is before we're willing to say that the system is broken and we would, agree to it being fixed. So, because we're using an all electric facility, we have zero carbon emissions off of our facility, everything's electric. Because we're taking trucks from essentially LA Long Beach, if you imagine a container going through there by truck, we're between 55 and 70% lower carbon emissions than if you use a truck and go through LA Long Beach. And so at one point, I think we called it the eco port, and then people were like, yeah, don't greenwash it, it just sounds like so we got changed to the Pacific Coast. Next. So this is a job count, 9,400 jobs in Aurora. And this is between Coos Bay, the rail line, and Lane County. And that's what caught my interest, because I certainly had done business in Oregon, but on a limited scale and never tried a project like this before. And, Lee and I had a bill, and the last time I got it, I was pretty interested in this bill in 2011, 766, that the mayor of Portland at the time, I think, called it Armageddon. I remember right. And it was to speed up industrial permitting. It was to say, look, if it's zoned industrial or we need to do a big industrial project, most things need to fall by the wayside to get the job done. And I think we muscled it through. I don't remember how much compromising we had to do, but Lee was the chair luckily. And so we got it through his committee, and either through Ways and Means or my committee. But it's scary to try large, giant projects. And this is $2.3 to $2.5 billion project. 500 million is sort of our annual revenue projected, but the key thing for most legislators, where they want to see job growth and in a way that they think fits, environmental friendliness that Oregon is famous for. So we're trying to deliver that. Next. So I will just mention just two more facts about my hometown. My high school was 2,100 people when my dad went there. It was 1,400 when I went there. It's 750 now. So the population dipped for a while and then sort of stabilized with retirees largely moving in, but it's not sustainable. There's a baby boom that's big demographically, and many of them have tier 1 PERS. When that all ends, this town will shrink considerably. And if it doesn't get something to rebuild its middle class, it was not easy to grow out there during that time. And my family was minimal, 4 layoffs for my mom. That was minimal compared to what other people. I mean, at least she was able to do something to keep us going. But it was a very thriving, healthy community. So seeing it come back is a real passion. I actually don't care about the money. I'm an investor, but I could care less about that part. It's being my daughter's name, I think, anyway, just for tax reasons. But I want to see Coos Bay thrive again and be the kind of town it was, which was dominant in, the biggest football league in the state. It won 3 state championships in a row at one time. And, they got themselves back together and shrunk a few leagues, or maybe 3 leagues. And then they got back up one and won another state championship a few years ago. So there's some hope there that I haven't seen in a really long time. So then the question is, well, what's next? And we had 2 years of working on this real actively, seeking a particular federal grant that Congressman DeFazio, who was the chair of the committee that wrote the law, said would be the right one to get. And he battled mightily to try and make some of the federal agencies fit our project into their mold, which they did not want to do because they're siloed. So the DOT was not that interested in dredging or funding dredging. They said, well, that's the Army Corps' problem. We said, look, it's one big project. We have to dredge, we have to build a railroad, we have to build a terminal, and this is a big multifaceted project. But pushing down this one track, which turns out we were in competition with the I-5 bridge the whole time, and that was not going to win that. But what our strategy was, just push super hard down a track and then see if something else becomes available to you if you don't get that one. So for Oregon, it's great. I-5 bridge got a several $100 million grant. And then what we got was a phone call from the President of the United States to our 2 senators and the Congresswoman from that area. And in it, on December 21st, President Biden had Pete Buttigieg, the Secretary of Transportation, and Mitch Landrieu, who's was the National Director of Infrastructure, on the call. And he basically ordered them to build. Like I've memorized it many times. He said, Pete, I've never told you what to do before. You're smart as hell, but this is important to me. So I want you to get it done and move as fast as you can with the Army Corps of Engineers. Unless it's illegal, get it done. So we have to, of course, do our NEPA and our environmental impact statements, but it was a direct order to do it. So after that, he called it a strike team. Now it's a very boring name, the multi-agency work group. So it meets monthly as a whole group. There are 80 participants from the federal government and state government, plus our company, plus the port. And then we have 7 committees. I think the next one is actually this afternoon. Again, tomorrow we meet probably 3 or 4 times a week to accelerate the project on permitting, on funding, on community engagement. And so it's very real, it's very active. I spent 2 months in Asia, 6 weeks already in Asia this year, and I have another 6 weeks starting here June 25th, just talking to customers, which are for us, the shipping companies, and making sure that we're meeting their particular needs to make this all reality. So I went on a long time, but let's go to questions
Yeah, we are really up against it with our programming. So any real quick question for Brian that he can crank out for you?
Good work.
Keep up the good work. And I would just like to say, Brian is one of those just definitions of bipartisanship, working across the aisles, and has been a very strong supporter of this organization for the entirety of its term. And we have very much enjoyed partnering with Brian over the years, and we love seeing, quite honestly, his success in this space. And so, Brian, know you that
good mentors.
Yes, great mentors and the like. So with that, I know Representative Clem and Paloma are probably close to their departure time. But we've got a great second part of the program here. And to kick off the transportation piece is going to be former Senator Metsger. And then I think, Rick, you were kind of teeing up. What, are you teeing up Senator Beyer?
I'm gonna tee up Senator Beyer because he's gonna have kind of an overview and then we'll go from there. How's that?
Love it. Thank you.
5-minute video that kind of
Great.
outlines the transportation issues.
One thing I'd like to recognize, Dan Johnson does an incredible job on all our audio visual and our imagery. It's clear to me that those who are online may not hear all of this. And if you are online and watching, we apologize. But we will get this posted. When we repost the video, we'll have it so you can hear it on YouTube.
Maintaining our transportation system, whether that's fixing potholes, plowing snow, or helping stranded travelers, is something most people can agree the government should do. But governments across the US are cutting back on maintenance. Why is that? You have to go back to when the modern transportation system was first built. At the turn of the 20th century, the public demanded a new network of roads that would allow them to travel with ease and speed. Governments faced a problem: how to pay for it. In 1919, Oregon paved the way by adopting the country's first gas tax. After that, virtually every transportation agency across the country adopted one too. In Oregon, gas tax receipts are combined with fees on vehicles and freight haulers to form the State Highway Fund. That fund then distributes money to transportation agencies across the state. For decades, the gas tax worked great. With it, Oregon built tens of thousands of miles of roads and thousands of bridges. It funded the construction of bike lanes, sidewalks, stoplights, and guardrails. But the gas tax is starting to show its age in 2 different ways. First, vehicles have gotten more fuel efficient. The average new passenger vehicle sold today uses 25% less gas than 20 years ago. By 2035, 100% of new vehicles sold in Oregon will be electric. The switch to EVs is driving carbon emissions from transportation down 60% over the next 25 years. But no matter how little gas they use, vehicles still wear down the road. Second, the gas tax has had a rough time keeping up with inflation. The federal gas tax hasn't increased since 1993. And unlike 19 other states, Oregon's gas tax isn't pegged to inflation, the price of fuel, or fuel economy. With every year that passes, the same dollar gets you less and less. The impact of inflation doesn't end with the gas tax itself. Since 2019, steel has gone up by 75%, concrete by 32%, and asphalt by 39%. So what happens when available funding can't keep pace with increasing costs? Tough choices have to be made. Which brings us to what's happening today. Transportation agencies everywhere are cutting their maintenance budgets. As maintenance gets cut, Oregon's transportation system is getting more vulnerable to natural disasters. Without crews to clear culverts or trim hazardous trees or plow snow, roads are staying closed longer after storms. The system is getting dirtier, with crews unable to keep up with growing volumes of trash and graffiti, or restore campsites as quickly as they used to. Without sufficient staffing, incident response teams are slower to the scene to clear crashes, support first responders, and get traffic moving again. Travelers are facing slower and more dangerous travel in winter conditions. Roads are getting rougher, with conditions getting bad enough that agencies are lowering speed limits to give people more time to navigate safely. Customer service is declining. As DMV staffing gets cut, people will wait longer for help. The decline in our transportation system won't be limited to state highways. It will happen to local and neighborhood roads, sidewalks, and bike lanes too. Rural and urban areas are struggling with these cuts. Transportation agencies can't cut their way out of the problem because the problem is a permanent decline in revenue. Okay, so let's take a look at what we can do about this as a state. Unfortunately, 3 big sources of funding are off the table. Federal funding can't be used for maintenance. Money collected from tolls can be used to maintain the toll road, but it can't be directed to statewide maintenance. Lastly, funding dedicated to projects by state law, which makes up a large percentage of ODOT's budget, can't be directed to statewide maintenance without legislative action. Of all the state funding available to ODOT, less than 10% can be used for maintenance services. But the good news is that there are lots of different ways to fund a safe and efficient transportation system. One option would be to expand Oregon's existing pay-per-mile or road usage charge program. It's a modern-day take on the gas tax, in that the more you drive on the road, the more you pay to maintain and improve it. The state could also raise revenue through registration or other vehicle fees, or it could fill the gap with general fund resources. While the gas tax won't last forever, a gas tax increase could cover the costs of maintaining the system in the near term, while we work out how to fund it in the long term. And lastly, indexing these fees to inflation would make sure the system stays funded long into the future. With tough choices ahead, Oregonians will need to decide how much they want to maintain their transportation system and how best to pay for it.
All right. Lee, I think I'll have to follow Lee. He's the in case you don't know, he is on the state Transportation Commission as well as the former chair of the committee. So in deference to that, I think you should say.
Okay. So between Rick and I think we've spent probably the last 20 years chairing the legislative committees on transportation. And one of the good things that's happened over the years is there have been 5 funding proposals since the early 2000s to improve the system, make capital improvements in the system. And those have all been really good projects. They've all done really well. I think the mistake that collectively we've made, the legislature made, is we didn't fund maintenance. That's the dilemma that we face today. And it's not just ODOTs and the state systems, it's cities and counties in the same situation. My city, where I live in Springfield, just passed their second bond to do some maintenance, $20 million, portions of 6 roads. The actual need to fix it in that city in Springfield is probably 6 times that, just to get it up to date. And that situation is repeated across the state. It's particularly a problem for the smaller cities who don't have the capacity to do that, and for the counties which just have miles and miles of roads that are out there. I grew up in a rural community in eastern Nebraska, and as a kid, when my family moved when I was 16 to Oregon, one of the things that just amazed me is how many paved roads we have in the state. You go to the Midwest and almost everything is gravel. that was largely through the largesse of the timber industry that you had that pays a lot for that. And a lot of what we call farm or forced to urban to market situations. Well, we're past that and we have not been keeping our system up. So the dilemma that really came up in the last year, and I will admit, putting on the hat as a ODOT Transportation Commissioner, there's a lot of things that I learned that I didn't know as a legislator in the details of that. And the thing is, we just don't have the money to maintain the system that we have, and the need, quite frankly, is probably double the budget if you wanted to do everything. That's not going to happen. But the situation that we're in now is the legislature, through the Joint Committee on Transportation, kicked off on Tuesday night a tour of the state to ask that very question. Here's the situation. Oregon is what you want to do about it. Big needs. We did that in 2016. We came up with a list of projects, all of which are underway, have been, most of which have been completed. The promise to the citizens, what you paid for got done, with the exception of a couple big projects in Portland. One of which changed a whole lot. It's not a bad project, but it's gone up in price a lot. So putting covers over the freeway around the Rose Quarter. What the community wants up there is a whole lot different than what was originally envisioned when it was passed in the legislature. But it also, from a transportation side, that intersection of Interstate 5 and Interstate 84 is one of the most congested points on the interstate system across the country. And the trucking industry, that's what they wanted. So you got to fix that so we can do things together. And I think one of the things that people don't understand, you think about it, I become fond of saying that Oregon is an export economy that runs on wheels. Those wheels need roads to run on. We get through that. So that's kind of the dilemma. And the other one, my other favorite saying is roads are like shoes. They wear out. And we have to fix those. So that's kind of the dilemma, and I'll just put it to you. This last year, in the last short legislative session, before that, we went to the governor and said, we don't have enough money to maintain the system to adequately take care of moving the ice and the snow off the roads in the winter, addressing accidents and all that. So we have to make some priority decisions. Our decision is we're going to cut back on that and only maintain the primary road system for snow removal and that. We used to get maybe 3 and 4 passes. We're going to do it once, maybe. That's what we can. We're going to not restripe the fog lines on the rural roads and that, which I think is really dangerous. You cannot see them. Those white lines are there. You can't see it. It rain at nighttime. It's just reality. The legislature responded to that and did something I never thought they would do. They appropriated $20 million in general funds to get us through to the next legislative session. And they added a little bit extra to that out of the request from the metro area business community to take care of the graffiti removal, trash removal, primarily, in fact, exclusively. I don't think that will happen again with all the demands. So the question is, what do we do about that? There are different things we can do. The primary challenge in terms of maintaining the roads today is that the traditional road source, funding source, the gas tax, has worked really well, as the video said, isn't working as well now, and it won't work into the future. So we have to have a different source of funding to do it. The nice thing about the gas tax is it's really inexpensive to collect. So the efficiency is really good in terms of collecting things. And over the past 100 years, it has been a great proxy for a user fee. Everybody was getting about the same mileage, and so you were paying the cost of doing it. It's not working anymore, particularly if you move to higher mileage vehicles, and particularly electric vehicles as we move to that, which will happen. You know, there's a lot of controversy about it, but it will happen over the next 20 years. So we have to find a different way of doing that. Road usage fee is one that's been talked about, or where you pay is essentially what you pay today, but you are paying with the gas tax. It's about on average 2 cents a mile to do that. we have to have something that does it. We've had an experiment going on. Gosh, we
Years.
started doing that for 20 years when people voluntarily have been doing that through various ministries. It's got some problems with people who are really freaked out about the government knowing where they're driving. They don't care where you drive, they only know how much you drive. And so we have private vendors, which has made it a very inefficient system, expensive to collect. That can be fixed. That's one. And probably a gas tax increase in the short term transition. So those are part of the dilemmas. Another thing that we did do, it's on the DMV side. Amy, the director of DMV in the last 18 months, 2 years, has done an amazing job of taking a lot of that stuff that you used to have to go into the office to do a transaction. Everybody complains about DMV, put it offline. We automated as much as that as we can with dealers and stuff to just make it a little better. But there's still some stuff that has to go there. The problem is that the DMV system, the way we've used it, is when we increased registration, we dedicated the revenue to projects. So we're at the point now where DMV, the registration fees do not cover the cost of administering the licensing, registration programs there. And some of it is because we passed part of it off to local governments. So we have changed that system. We're working on doing that. And one last point I would make is people don't really understand that every dollar that the state revenue fund, that transportation fund collects, half of that goes directly to local governments, 30% to counties, 20% to cities. So the amount that ODOT has left over after we fund the legislatively mandated projects is a very small piece of that. So, no maintenance. If we don't change it out of necessity, ODOT will, or transportation will direct it, will maintain the intercity freight mobility system. So we'll spend, first priority will be to keeping I-5 and 84 in good shape so we can keep the economy moving, followed by 97 and a couple of the other routes, but it'll essentially mean that we will not be maintaining most of the state highways other than that. And I think the cities are the same thing. So that's the dilemma of the problem. And I guess my pitch to you is we're going to be, the legislature is going to be considering that over the next year and coming up with a proposal. And I encourage you to get involved. It's one of the things from an economic side. I was listening to almost everybody, I would say everybody's job and income is depending on the transportation system. If you think about it from the business perspective, the transportation system, the freight system delivers supplies, components to your business. If you're manufacturing something and it goes out the same way. If you're selling something, it's probably moving out on a truck in this state. So there's a big dependency there that we kind of don't want to think about. I will tell just one anecdote, and I always tell this one. It reminds me of people's disconnect. Back in the 90s, when I was in the state house, I was in a grocery store on the weekend during the legislative session. And one of my neighbors recognized me, came up to me and he said, "Representative Beyer, can't you do something about all the trucks on the roads?" And it just struck me as funny. I says, "Well, that depends." And she says, "What do you mean it depends?" I says, "Well, let's look around the store here. Everything on every shelf came here on a truck." That's kind of the dependence of it. So I'll stop there, right?
Yeah. It's great working with Lee. As he said, for 2 decades back to back, I did 12 years, and then Lee chaired the Senate Transportation Committee. And actually, I begin by saying I'm actually to blame for a lot of the problems that ODOT's just going to shoulder it. Although I'll share it with Bruce Starr, who's coming back into the legislature. He's not responsible, but the two of us. For what we call the Oregon Transportation Investment Act, TIA 1, TIA 2, and TIA 3, and the joint JTA, the Transportation Act, Jobs and Transportation Act. Because when we started, and I just kind of want to frame this in the time, is talking about 2002, 2003. And we had the recession, as you recall, it hit really hard. And, you know, job was the priority. At that time, ODOT basically had no debt. Okay, so we had a pretty good white, we wanted to break jobs. So as Lee said, you know, we would raise some fees on gas tax, we would raise some things on title fees and registration, and then we would dedicate that to projects to create jobs, right? So it wasn't going to maintain the system, it was going to create jobs and build, you know, shiny new objects. So we did that, then we repeated that again, then we had a bridge issue, we said, okay, we'll do that, we'll dedicate these monies to bridges, then the Jobs and Transportation Act. In order to buy enough votes to pass it, I had to build a thing in Dundee, called a bypass, and build everything else to put this together. But all these dollars though are, you know, you've got the increases, and these are not increases to pay for the system, they're to pay for all the new shiny objects, essentially. So now we're in a situation where, as you know, Lee mentioned and through the video that you saw, is we have a situation where we have, in terms of buying power, declining revenue, right? And the key things that we care about, obviously safety, preservation, maintenance, just isn't there. You know, I live downtown Salem by the Capitol, and I came up Commercial the other way, you know, come around. And if you notice this, like, of course, the sun was kind of shiny, but it's like, as I left downtown, I'm making the curve coming up 10 blocks to come back, you know, in this way. Now, if you ever noticed on Commercial there, it looks like someone took a bunch of big buckets of tar and threw just all over the road there on Commercial Street. All you see is these black, it's a spider web all the way through for 20 blocks. And it's just people trying to patch, I mean, this major thoroughfare. I mean, it just looks like third world, right? But the fact of the matter is that the money isn't there. So a couple of things I think to kind of spark up the discussion here is the next session. So as Lee mentioned, the Joint Transportation Committee is starting a statewide tour to talk about, you know, state transportation acts. And Lee and I have both been a part of those. So let me tell you kind of what's going to happen, but what the reality needs to be. Reality is people are going to come in, they talk about all the things they need. I mean, that's what they say. I want this, we need this for here, we need this for public transportation, we need this for the highway. That's not what's gonna happen. You can't. There's no shiny new objects next session. Right now, we're talking about what state needs as funding to maintain the system that we have right now. Plus the obligations that we already have. I haven't been done major ones, you know, the I-5 interstate bridge, the Rose Quarter, you've got the Boone Bridge, you got other things that, you know, aren't even are being moved back down the STIP now because there isn't money for that. So the key issue will be, how are we going to fund maintaining the system we have now before we talk about expanding things? Whereas in the last 20 years, it's always about, I want this bypass, I want this road, I want this bridge. The money isn't there to do that. So that's the discussion, I think, from, especially from a chamber standpoint, business, how do we make a decision on what is the best way to fund this system, you know, that's as equitable as possible, as comprehensive as possible, and ensure accountability how those dollars are spent. So I think those are, it's really kind of the trifecta that we need to look at. Now, in the video, there's a number of things that were talked about in terms of the road user fee and gas tax and other things. So I'm going to throw out a couple of things that aren't generally talked about that are going to be talked about. But, you know, and just to, you know, for consideration as people decide what is the best, you know, policy to go. One that isn't mentioned there, no one says anything about a retail sales tax for transportation. Okay, 19 states get a lot of their transportation dollars with retail sales tax for transportation. Texas, which isn't exactly known as a liberal state, gets $2.5 billion a year sales tax goes to transportation. Same thing in Idaho, Washington, California, whatever. Now in Oregon, and you notice that's not mentioned. In terms of efficiency, it's not as efficient as gas tax, but some of the other things much more efficient. Like in Oregon, we've always had this
Oh, really? Kelsey?
philosophy. Two things. Number one is, we don't have a sales tax in Oregon, right? And we don't pump our own gas. Well, I just threw that one off the table. Now we do pump our own gas. And we actually haven't talked about that for 30 years, any kind of sales thing. It's been a third of a century since that was ever seriously talked about. We have a whole different generation of people now, and in terms of, like Lee said, look at the shelf. Everybody benefits from transportation, whether you're on the road or not. People are delivering goods and services, et cetera. So one thing that, is that may be a topic that will come up. In the past in Oregon, it's always, we never talked about transportation system. We talked about sales tax, funding government, all of government, right? These large 6, 7, 8% sales tax. A one penny, I talk about efficiency, but 1 penny. So 1%, that $8 Subway sandwich. If you had 1 penny, cost you $8.08, right? $8.08. That 1 penny is $1 billion if I found out from legislative. All these other options pale in the amount of money. And who knows, like Lee mentioned, the heavy lift of people thinking government's watching them and all these other things, pales. So that's one that I think, it's going to be talked about. Is that a more efficient way, and it's more comprehensive and it covers everybody, et cetera. The other thing is to look at that I think it's going to come up. Again, I'm not advocating any of these. I'm telling you what the things that they're not saying that are going to that will be coming up. That you want to figure out what is the matrix that we want to be supportive of or want to keep an eye on. The other one is, and I'll say this because this is be a sensitive issue for the commissioner, but we're the only state in the union that half the money goes to cities and counties. Nobody else does. Okay. Now, they do provide some, different states will provide some grants and they'll share some revenues with cities and counties. Oregon's the only one that just gives half the money away to city counties. Also around the country, cities and counties are primarily responsible for funding their own transportation system, right? So I would expect that distribution formula will be discussed. Okay. So if you're a city or a county, you should know that. It's a lot easier to vote to not raise any tax and just keep the money you already got. If you want it, Polk County or you guys go ahead and take care of it, right? So that's another one that I think we'll be talking about. What about the distribution system of the money we're collecting now? Should this be used for maintenance and preservation of our main transportation system that we collect on the state level? Cities and counties take a greater responsibility. Portland just passed renewed, a gasoline tax, for 10 cents for maintenance and preservation there. That's kind of typical in other states that they fund 75% of their own stuff. So I want to throw those two things out. They're not on the slide. You haven't heard them, but those are going to be things that will be worked. So you should think about, okay, what would be our position in either or? Because we're not going to be in a situation to solve the problems, as Lee mentioned, and as the video certainly articulated, by just sitting back and doing nothing. We're going to have to figure out how do we preserve our system, maintain our system that we already have, because the cost, and those of you who've been involved this a long time have probably seen some of these things. When a road that you have deteriorates, the cost of bringing that back up to where it is exponential to just maintain it in the first place. Just to put another coat of asphalt on is a lot cheaper than when it all breaks down and you have to rebuild the whole thing. It's 3 or 4 times more expensive. So, how do we fund transportation? How do we make it most equitable? How do we make it as efficient as possible? And how do we make it as accountable to the taxpayer, or whoever, people are paying, that we know those dollars are going to. That's going to be the focus on the Transportation Act next year. Again, it won't be the shiny new objects. It's like, how do we get that plug in the dike and start maintaining the system so it doesn't all totally degrade, or like he says, gravel roads into Metsger. So that's my overview of how I see things playing out. I don't know which direction it's gonna go, but I would say from a business standpoint, from a local government standpoint, you need to be aware that these things are all going to be considered. And the question won't be what you oppose, the question is gonna be, what are you going to be supportive of? Because something has to move forward. And as Paloma was saying on her issue, I think it's better to be proactive and decide what you're willing to do than sit there and wait to see what's gonna happen and then sit there and come and complain to the Senate and the House Transportation Committee that you don't like it. Proactive, especially on a business section, I think is very important.
We're now going to turn it over to the audience for questions. Would somebody like to start us off? Yes, Lyle.
So first off, your comment, counties represent 60% of the roads in the state, just so everybody understands that. When we operate that with 30% of the funds. So it's a major challenge for counties. And we really appreciate working with ODOT. On your tour that you'll be going through the state, if you can make a stop, an extra stop in Salem, you bypass Salem. So you go from Albany or to Portland, but for the Mid-Willamette Valley, which we are in the way, you can't go anywhere throughout the state without passing through this region. We'd really appreciate a tour to hear what we have in this region.
Commissioner, it's not us, it's not.
I know.
We're not on that.
I don't have to travel there, I just stay there.
I'm staying quiet. But my main point is I saw next year's budget, and next year's budget is going to be focused on maintenance. No new projects, which I'm totally in favor of. But looking at the budget, it's got $270 million in maintenance, but it's got $135 million in bicycle pedestrian projects.
Yes.
So why would we invest $135 million in bicycle pedestrian projects when we're looking at all the maintenance we have? That's 1/3 of the budget. Bicycle maintenance does not pay any permitting or any fees to ride on our roads. But yet everybody drives a car or buses on every street. Transit's another huge, they got a huge increase in their budget last year. Buses have to ride on our roads. So I think this, when you talk about cooperation and collaboration, we need to look at this whole entire thing and find out ways where instead of just cutting maintenance, we need to pull a little bit back from every avenue. And then pull a lot of that bicycle pedestrian. We can do some, include them in all of our projects that we're doing now. That is a huge portion of the project, is creating that alternative mobility throughout the state.
Yeah.
Which I have no issues with that, but it's got to make sense.
Yeah.
For all of us.
So I would make a comment on that, Lyle, because I think you're right, and it goes to my point of, see, you had, because of your position and your experience, you see a lot of things that the average person isn't gonna see or even the legislature, right? So, is taking that information and saying, okay, here's how we would approach this, here's how we think it should approach, here's why. I think that could be very, very, very important, making that discussion.
I would add that I was at the hearing. I was in the audience at the hearing, the first one the legislature done on Tuesday night. Probably better than 80, probably better than 85% of the people who came and talked about bicycles, adding more bicycles and pedestrian. Which, by the way, are all capital projects, they're not maintenance projects.
Just a couple of things to your point. We have the chamber of actually make that request the church that are Salem. They are having hearings at the Capitol, but actually Salem deprioritized because we're so close. So they prioritize the others. So we made that request.
Happy to.
And to you, Senator Beyer, sorry, you'll always be Senator Beyer. The first stop was in Portland, so I think it's really natural to hear a lot about pedestrian and bikes because it's obviously something that's near and dear, particularly to the people who tend to show up to these kinds of things. I've been to a lot of them. Both of these gentlemen have been to even more than I've ever been to. So, you know, it will be interesting as they take a show around the state. Start coming out to East Oregon, Douglas County, my people in Douglas County, to hear the differences. And it'll be important, you know, working with the other chambers to really heighten what those differences are throughout the state. I know, you know, getting into Elton, yeah, well, no, there's no biking there.
I hope they all bike out there.
I wanted to ask that one Tuesday night, but I was in the audience.
Bike rack is full and I see a lot of helmets in here. Thank you. Next question for our presenters. Yeah, I'll bring up an interesting dynamic. Oh, Brent,
I
please.
just had a good question, like, in fairness to what's happening in the roads. How are we taxing for road use? This huge growth of EV currently?
How are we taxing for road use? The two major sources of funding are the gas tax. And for trucks, it's a weight mile tax. It's usually.
But on the EV side, with the increase in EVs out there, how are they paying their fair share?
They're not.
Well, so that's a fair share. The registration fee for an EV now is double or something, or it's a lot more than.
For electric vehicles,
That's
yeah.
one way. But that does already, that gets to the whole core of the problem. Eventually, you have a lot more in there. That's certainly not enough. That's why the road user experiment is part of that.
In 2017, we tried to adjust that in the legislature. Ryan Boquist, Senator Boquist and I were both working on that. We asked our comment was that EVs are not paying their share. So we asked the transportation professionals, the legislative fiscal people, not fiscal, revenue people, to tell us what an average car would pay, an average driver would pay in gas taxes. And we converted that to an additional fee at registration for EVs. As it turned out, we were off by about 60%. And some of that is they've improved a lot since then. So that was the idea, is that they would pay through a registration fee on top of that. So there was an attempt, and certainly at the very least, I would hope the legislature would adjust that.
Yeah, there's a thought out there within the community that as we continue to pour more and more dollars into bike lanes and pedestrians, and we allow the EV side not carry the fair load, well, the light vehicles and industrial use gets to share the bigger part of the burden. And that's just flat out not fair. So that's something I hope that we get more engagement with throughout. And then the second question I've always had, I can't find the data, I'd love to find it somewhere. Federally, we had that big infrastructure spending bill. And I know some dollars came in from the greater project. How much did Oregon get on that infrastructure spending bill?
For the interstate bridge, I'm guessing that we're gonna end up getting about $1.2 billion, maybe a little bit more, maybe as much as $2 billion for that project. That's a very expensive project. Each of the two states have, out of their general fund, they've committed and put the dollars up, $1 billion for that project. Then for the Rose Quarter project in Portland, it looks like the feds are gonna give $1 billion for that. They've allocated $450 million, and there's another grant application that the Federal Department of Transportation asked the state to submit for that project for another $750 million. And then there's some other money that came into the cities and stuff for just general projects on the system. The problem with federal projects, federal grants, is they are always capital grants. You would only spend them on a new construction capacity improvement.
We're real close to our concluding time, Mayor-elect Boy, and then Lyle, you'll be our last inquiry.
Yeah, it's probably a quick answer, but I've never plugged in the charging station. Is it free? Is it like public, private owned? Can there be a tax added to charging?
They vary, depends on who owns them. Most of them that are, you see on the screen, something like that, you pay through usually a credit card. Some of the public ones that are not free. If you own a Tesla, of course, I think it's baked into your price. all of Tesla's are free. Well, they're changing that policy.
Commissioner Wardhorse, our last inquiry.
So one last thing on funding. I noticed a lot of this is still putting the funding on locals, but we are a tourist state. When you look at the funding we get from our gas tax, there's a huge influx during the summer months with the tourists that come in. Is there any thoughts or ideas how we can still capitalize on that if we start getting away from the gas tax? That's a challenge.
That's the challenge of that. We have that challenge with the interstate trucking. Largely, most of the large companies, most of those have contract agreements with providers that go statewide, and they have computer systems that tell them where to fill up. And the problem from the state for that is, you're obviously, if you've got a 500-mile range on your tank, you're going to fill up at the cheapest place you can fill up. We actually benefit from that, or did, on the Oregon border between Idaho, because a lot of times they used to come over to Oregon, which was cheaper than Idaho. So I think that's shifted.
Let's thank our panelists for their time today. Thank you both, and appreciate the work you've done on behalf of our state and always being willing to engage with your local chambers. Tuesday night, how many hung online till about 10:30? I did. Watched the rerun. Great. We got a big thing going on, City Revenue Task Force, and we're very fortunate to have a few of our chamber leadership serving on that task force. A lot of major developments on Tuesday night, and I've asked incoming board member Bill Rickey to give us a very brief update of what occurred on Tuesday night.
So thanks, Tom. So we have near-term options. One's getting the most traction with business tax. Because what they highlighted, survey they did, keep in mind that survey was asked, should you pay more or should businesses pay more? And they chose business. But they also, were asked, should the goods and services provided by the business agree with this? And they said no. They don't connect the dots, right? We go to medium-term options, right? We've been tasked with getting 3 different options. So they, right, put a band-aid on the problem right now in terms of the proposed budget crisis. Some of the interim and then some of the long-term, like local tax reform. So medium-term options, income tax and a user fee. Those have gained a lot of traction. Revenue tax and income tax, and then the long-term payment in lieu taxes, everyone's very familiar with that, both state government and then not state government entities, which would be nonprofits. There's been lots of discussion surrounding that, who would be excluded. But that's kind of where we're at right now. The heavy hitters in those 3 categories.
Bill, first of all, I want to recognize Bill put a formal motion on the table to remove the business license fee from consideration. And although that did not gain traction, I appreciate what that is, the intent of that. Thank you, Bill. Please stay very in tune with what's occurring here. In fact, our organization is going to be helping our public understand a lot more of this in the coming weeks ahead. Through a key strategic partnership with one of our consulting firms. So please be watching for that. With that, again, the largest carbon tax proposal in the nation is heading our way right here in Oregon on the climate protection program. Really need everybody's attendance on Thursday, July 11th, 7 a.m. to 8:30 a.m. and we will tackle that discussion comprehensively, not just with the natural gas industry and our utilities, but also holistically with groups that are working to see how we can make this palatable across for our state without crushing our residents and businesses. With that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. Thank you to our presenters. We'll see you next month.